I asked the 5 big AI engines the kind of question a running shoe buyer types every single day. The best running shoes for a new runner. And then I did the part almost everyone skips. I opened every answer and traced where it came from. The real pages and posts each engine leaned on to build its reply. I expected the shoe brand's own websites to be carrying it. The product pages, the polished home pages, the spec sheets they pour their budget into. They were barely in there. Across the answers, the brand's own sites were a thin slice of the sources, and most of what the engines quoted came from places those brands do not own and cannot edit. So today I want to show you where AI answers come from, why your own website is a small part of the picture, and what that means for getting your brand named when a buyer asks. Because once you see the real source list behind these answers, you stop pouring your whole effort into the one page the engines barely read. Here's the piece that reframes the whole thing. When you ask one of these engines for the best anything, it does not answer from memory alone, the way a friend might rattle off a brand they once heard of. It runs a live search first, pulls a handful of pages and posts off the web, reads them, and writes its reply out of what those sources say. So the answer is only as strong as the sources it reached for, and the brands it names are the ones those pages were already talking about. The engine is not holding some private, settled opinion of your running shoe brand that you need to win over. It is repeating, in its own words, what the pages it trusts have said about the category this week. So the real contest plays out on those outside sources, not on the homepage you keep polishing, and that single shift changes where your work should go. The engine reads the web, then talks. If you are not in what it reads, you are not in what it says. Let me put a real number on how small that website slice is, because this is measured, not a guess. We track the same set of buyer questions across the 5 engines, and in one recent week, we logged more than 1,300 of the sources they pulled to back their answers. When we sorted those sources by who owned them, the brand's own websites came out between 6 and 23%, depending on which engine you looked at. Sit with that range for a moment. On the engine that leans on brand sites the most, fewer than a quarter of its sources were the brands themselves. And on the engine that leans on them least, it was about 1 in 20. Everything else, the other 70 to 90% of what the engines quoted, came from out on the open web. Reddit threads, review sites, magazine roundups, comparison articles, the occasional video. The places where people talk about running shoes, not the places where brands talk about themselves. Your site is in the mix, but it is far from the main source these engines draw on. So why do the engines lean this hard on other people's pages instead of yours? The reason sits in what they are built to do, which is recommend, not advertise. Your own product page says you make the best running shoes for a new runner. A review thread says someone bought a pair, ran 400 miles on them, and the heel finally gave out. The engine treats that second statement as the stronger evidence, because it comes from a person with nothing to sell. Independent voices are the point of a recommendation, so the engines lean on them above anything a brand says about itself. Your homepage can be flawless and still lose to a scrappy forum post, because the post carries the one thing your homepage never can, a buyer who is not you. This is the same instinct you use yourself. When a friend who owns the shoes tells you they hold up, you believe it more than the ad that talked you into looking. The engines learned that the trustworthy word comes from the side without a stake. It helps to picture the open web as the engine's reading list, the stack of pages it skims before it answers you. Meaning what counts is not how good your website is, but how often your name turns up on that reading list, in the pages the engine already trusts. You can have the cleanest site in your category and still be missing from every roundup, every thread, every review, and the engine will write a confident answer about the best running shoes that never once includes you. The engine did not weigh your brand and pass on it. Your brand was not in the room while it read. That is the quiet way solid brands go unmentioned. They poured everything into the surface they control, and nothing into the surfaces the engine consults. The work starts with accepting that your reach into these answers rides mostly on pages with someone else's name at the top. Now the part that makes this harder because the 5 engines do not read the same pages. ChatGPT leans on brand-owned pages the most, close to a quarter of its sources, so your own site earns its keep there more than anywhere else. Claude sits at the far other end, around one source in 20 from brand sites, and builds almost all of its answers from editorial write-ups and roundups. So the very page that wins you a mention on one engine can count for almost nothing on another, because the second engine was never going to read it. You could pour months into your own site, lift your standing on ChatGPT, and watch Claude carry on quoting a roundup you have no place in. Same brand, same week, same question, two answers built from two different piles of sources. So there is no single switch that turns on AI search for you. There are 5 reading lists, and you sit in a different spot on each one. The other 3 each have their own appetite too. Grok reaches hard for Reddit, far more than any of the others. So a single lively thread about the best beginner shoes can carry you on Grok while it does nothing for you elsewhere. Perplexity started pulling videos into its answers this year. A real slice of what it cites now points at clips that did not figure before. Gemini leans heavily on editorial pages and roundups, the long write-ups a publication keeps current. So if you only ever check one engine, the one you happen to open, you learn almost nothing about the other 4, and they are the ones quietly shaping most of the answers your buyers see. Each engine is reading its own corner of the web, on its own clock, trusting its own short list of sources. Treating all of that as one channel called AI search is how brands end up strong in one answer and invisible in the rest without ever knowing why. Let me make this concrete by walking through a week as one of those brands. Say you run a small running shoe brand, and a real chunk of your sales rides on showing up when a beginner asks an engine for the best pair to start with. Monday morning, you tidy your product page, sharpen the copy, add the specs and the sizing notes, and you feel good about the work. All that same week, ChatGPT is quoting a running magazine's Best for Beginners roundup that does not mention you, and Grok is leaning on a Reddit thread where 3 people talk up a rival. None of your week went into either of those pages, because neither of them is yours, and those are the exact pages the engines were reading. You spent your best hours polishing the one surface the answer barely touches. The work that would have moved you sat outside your own site the whole time, on pages other people write and control, and you would not even know it was happening, because from your seat the site looked busy and improved, while the answer your buyer saw never changed. Sit with the unfair edge of that for a second. You did good work. You improved a real page. You made no mistake a marketer could be blamed for, and you still did not move the answer at all. The effort was sound. It was aimed at the wrong target, at the surface you own instead of the surfaces the engine reads. So if you have ever felt that flicker of confusion, doing the right things on your site and watching your brand stay missing from the answers, this is the gap underneath it. You were optimizing for a reader that was not coming, while the reader that mattered, the engine, was off reading other people's pages. The good news buried in that is real. Once you know where the engine looks, you finally know where to aim. The lever was never broken. You were pulling the one next to it. So where do you start if your own site is a small slice of this? You start by working the sources the engines read, with the same care you once gave your own pages. Find the roundups in your category, the best running shoes pieces a writer refreshes each year, and get your brand fairly in front of the people who compile them. Show up in the review threads and the forums where real runners compare what they wear, not with a pitch, with answers other readers would thank you for. Claim and fill out your profiles on the review sites the engines quote from, so there is current, detailed, accurate material for them to pull. These are the pages already feeding the answers, so a mention earned on any one of them can show up across several engines at once. It is slower than editing your own homepage, and it compounds, because every credible source that names you widens the pool the engines build their answers from. There is one kind of page on your own site that still earns its way into these answers, so it is worth naming. Write an honest comparison, the best running shoes for new runners, and name your rivals in it. Give a fair account of where each one wins. The engines tend to treat a comparison that covers the whole field as closer to editorial than to a sales page, because it reads as someone weighing options rather than a brand pushing itself. So that single page can get pulled the way a third-party roundup does, even though it lives on your domain. It is the one spot where your own site can get treated as a trusted source, so it is worth the effort to write it straight and keep it current. Beyond that page, assume the heavy work lives off your site, out on the pages you have to earn rather than publish. Here is the catch that ties this together. You cannot work sources you cannot see, and almost nobody knows which pages each engine is pulling for their category this week. The roundup ChatGPT keeps quoting. The thread Grok cites again and again. The review site Claude builds half its answer from. All of that is sitting in plain sight inside the answers, for anyone who reads them closely every week and writes down what they find. Doing that by hand, across all 5 engines, week after week, is the chore that wears you down and slides off your list by the second month. So most brands never do it. They check one engine once, see a result they like or dislike, and go back to editing the page the engine barely reads. The brands that pull ahead are the ones watching the source list itself, catching the new roundup the week it starts getting cited, noticing the thread that keeps beating them while there is still time to show up in it. You cannot earn your way onto pages you have not noticed or deciding the answer. That is where loudmink comes in. It runs your buyer questions against each of the 5 engines on a set schedule and records, week by week, whether you were named, whether you were cited with a real link, and which sources got pulled in to build the answer. So instead of guessing, you can see the exact roundups, threads, and review pages feeding each engine, and go and earn your place on the ones that matter. The source list stops being a mystery you glance at once and becomes a record you can read, the page that keeps replacing you, the engine you are slipping on, the thread a rival owns that you could join. By hand or with a tool, the move underneath is the same. You stop treating your website as the whole game and start working the pages the engines read. So if you want to see where the 5 engines are pulling your brand from right now, you can run a free scan over at loudmink.ai and find out today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.